The City Hall actually, its previous identity was the municipal building. So, when Raffles came to Singapore, they had all this very simple rules and plans to govern the town. In the 1856, so the first municipal body was found. Municipal, or you call it a municipality, they actually defines a district or a town. When Raffles took over Singapore, it was known as Singapore Town. We were a town, not a country, right? We're not independent. So the municipal body looks after the facilities and services of the city or the town, and that would involve your health, sanitation rules, services like a water supply, and at some point in time, gas works. In 1887, there's a separation between the municipal district and the rural district because Singapore has grown very, very fast, population boom, everything. You can't have the same body governing a bigger body of population. So the idea of municipal limits, that means where is it the municipality and where is it the rural district, is actually drawn. Like, for example, from here, we are talking about Fullerton Building. It used to be our general post office, so that's the zero mark. Drawing out, it fans outwards towards Geylang. So the beginning, slightly cross the Kallang River. Geylang, beyond will be the rural district. And then if you go up north, that will be Ang Mo Kio, around the area just before Ang Mo Kio. Okay, and you turn this way, the Tanglin area, down this way toward just before Pasir Panjang Road. So usually from the harbour and the Fullerton, you go one big fan, one round, and anything beyond that area is the rural district. So in this area, or even with the rural board, they look after things like your sanitation, sewage, the waters, the roads, the welfare, including places like the hawkers and the vendors, itinerant peddlers, markets, cleanliness of the city, public safety, including traffic, first aid, public lighting like gas. Later you'll see a multimedia show tells you about how our public lighting was done. Did you know what was used to light our public lighting street lamps before we had electricity? I used to wonder. Gas. Gas coming out of Kallang Gas Works. So even in Europe and in Singapore at that time, the way to light a gas, you put on a ladder. There's a person who's hired to go around the town with the ladder, goes up the lamppost, it lights the lamp, and then some hours later when the sky is brighter, he comes back with the ladder and then he goes out and puts out the lamp. So this is done on a daily basis until 1956. Then the whole country had street lamps powered by electricity. The other things that the municipal government or council was responsible for was the licensing of vehicles. So today, your cars, you need to have license for your cars, but in the past, our bicycles were licensed. You've seen metal plates put on bicycles with license numbers, yeah? Rickshaws have to be licensed. Your rickshaw's the one where it's powered by human labor and not a bicycle. And subsequently, even trishaws are also licensed. Another thing, cemeteries, burials. You see, these are all the services that common people will require. It has nothing to do with government, foreign policies, internal policies. These are policies and services that impact your daily life. The municipal council was actually housed formerly in the town hall. Victoria, before they built Victoria Theatre, the town hall was there. And then after that, they actually bought a space of a hotel that was situated on this side. It's called Hotel La Europe. And then in 1924 to 29, the 5 years, they start to plan the municipal building. 1924, they started planning. 1929, they completed the building. In 1939, as war had started in Europe, it was a standard operating procedures to plan for air raid attacks. Not that they think at all that Singapore would even be attacked by the Japanese. The Japanese inclusion in the war was much later, so that's why all this complacency. But nevertheless, they prepared for it, and the municipal building, together with other big buildings in this area, were shortlisted, or I would say identified as buildings where you can get shelter during an air raid. And why so? Because this is a very big building, very, very strong, and the bombs in those days are not like the bombs today. They probably just damaged the top 2 layers. So when you see a big building, what they do, the basement is very important. Basement has always been considered very useful to hide from air raid attacks. And if you can't get into a basement, you can actually hide yourself in a very strong corner of the building, not here, but at least inside. You find a corner and you crouch down. When war actually came and when the air raid actually happened in Singapore, they started building bunds around the building. This is to prevent anyone from being injured or killed by a flying debris. Because even if it hit the road and all that, you have stones and metal bits flying, which is usually the cause of death during an air raid. So eventually, as you all know, the reason why we're having this tour is to commemorate the battle for Singapore. In 1942, 15 February, Singapore fell to the Japanese. The Japanese took over the running of Singapore and they took over the use of this building as well. So basically what they do is they just take over everything that the British had to give up and then run it as if it was theirs. They did not do anything more, whatever they took over. And we know that during that time in 1943, there was one event that happened that most of the time is not mentioned in our history records. It's actually the march past by the Indian National Army. Now, the Indian National Army was formed by Chandra Bose, who actually thought that it was an opportunity for them to fight for the liberation of India from British rule. So he collaborated with the Japanese, hoping that they would also help his cause. But unfortunately, that did not happen. But nevertheless, in 1943, there was a march past and the Japanese premier, Hideki Tojo, and Chandra Bose was standing here taking salutes from the Indian National Army contingents. But that was just a ceremony. There was no indication that the INA, Indian National Army, ever occupied any office inside the building. So then 1945, the formal surrender of the Japanese forces took place inside the building. And they signed the instrument of surrender. Louis Mountbatten came out onto these steps, these very steps. He came out, he took off his service cap, and then he did the 3 shouts, hip hip hooray. So that's 1945 for you. And 1946, we have the medal award ceremony to award the Force 136, people who fought against the Japanese during that time. Many of them died. So award ceremony was carried out here. And 1 week later, about 6 days later, there was a memorial service for Mr. Lim Bo Seng, our national war hero, lost his life during the war. And there was a memorial service for him, after which his casket was brought to the MacRitchie Reservoir. This is so far up to the post-war narrative of events that happened on the steps here. Okay, so this is Persecution. It's an old painting by Koh Sia Yong. Koh Sia Yong is a Singapore second-generation artist, born in 1938. He would have been a few years old when war came to Singapore. This is painted from information that he heard from elders at that time. This is a scene, or what he imagined, a scene of an execution about to happen. Okay, so Sukching was a very systematic form of extermination carried out by the Japanese. It all starts with screening. They have various screening centers all over Singapore to pick up what they term as anti-Japanese elements. So who will these anti-Japanese elements be? Chinese, could be anybody suspected, even with, there could be information provided by all these informants, or at least someone they think, but they will just judge arbitrarily whether the person would be an anti-Japanese element. Anyone they think who would be working for the British, any Chinese working for the British. I've heard that they could pick up a person just based on a trick. They would just say hello, and if you were to turn back and they say, okay, you understood that English word, you work for the Japanese, now go up the lorry, they'll pick you up. Okay, and then the third one would be anyone who could be a soldier in civilian disguise. So in any case, that's how they round up people who mostly were never to be seen again. They're asked to go up to the lorries, bound with barbed wires or ropes or anything, and brought to the seaside for execution. So this is a scene that the artists imagined, that there would have been some beatings that have been carried out. You look at the faces, you are encouraged to come up forward later to look and examine the faces of the people who knew that something bad was going to happen, as also represented by the very dark, foreboding clouds in this painting. And there you see there's one person here who walked with his head up high. So to represent some of the people who knew what the ending was going to be, but who faced it very bravely. So there were several massacre sites in Singapore. I mean, Changi, you have Punggol. All these sites are marked by the National Heritage Board. And the bodies were used to be left there. So there was a massacre that was carried out at Keppel Harbour, where the bodies were left as they were, and they floated away to Sentosa Island, then known as Pulau Belakang Mati. So this is a sculpture by Dora Gordin. Dora is an Estonian artist based in the UK. And the significance of this sculpture is that the person who modeled for the artist is actually Elizabeth Choi, our national hero. So Elizabeth Choi, you know, she and her husband used to run a canteen at the mental hospital, Woodbridge Hospital, but it was not a mental hospital at the time. It was a hospital for just like any hospital, and the soldiers were recuperating there. And she and her husband was helping to pass things and information to them, and they were caught. She was caught later than her husband, but nevertheless, she was also starved and repeatedly tortured for 200 days. Good thing is she survived. And so the British sent her to the UK to recuperate. We believe that to be about 3 years. So if Singapore was regained freedom in 1945 in September, she may have left late 45, early 46. And what happened is that in the 3 years when she was there, she wanted to study art, but did not have enough funds. So her way to pay for her art studies was to model for the artists. And so this is the outcome of her modeling session. In fact, there was 2 artworks produced out of it. And one is Flawless Crystal that is on display or still in the UK, but she brought this back with her, Serene Jade. She left it to her daughters, and her daughters donated it to the country. Her contribution to the country didn't end there. She actually started to run for elections in 1950, and she served full term 5 years as a legislator. In the meantime, she was also teaching in St. Andrews. So she was doing everything at the same time. But subsequently, she decided that she would contribute better to the country if she was to remain as a teacher. So I guess to focus on her work. And she was the principal for School of the Blind. She returned to St. Andrews Junior and was promoted to deputy principal in 1964. Now, Elizabeth Choi lived a full life to a ripe old age of 96 when she passed away, 2006. So this is Oil on Canvas by Liu Kang. Liu Kang is one of the 4 pioneers of the Singapore art history. This was painted during the time that his family went to Ipoh. They escaped to Ipoh to stay away from the situation here. So this is a Malay man holding a rifle. So this brings us to the Malay regiment from Malaysia, and they were formed in Port Dickson. Port Dickson is a resort right now, so that's where they were formed. It started as an experiment, but the British military noticed that they performed very well and they could be very useful in the defense force. So what happened was the Malay regiment was sent to Singapore in 1940, but also the situation in Malaysia, the fighting, the Japanese were very, very strong, and the British forces were basically always overpowered, outnumbered. And so we started retreating downwards. And so they all ended up in Singapore by February 1942. And the hardest combat that took place was on the 12th, 13th, and 14th of February, up to 1 day before the fall of Singapore, up at Opium Hill, which is today in Pasir Panjang. So the Malay regiment was almost wiped out in that combat. A lot of them died, a total of 159 deaths recorded, of which 146 of them were soldiers, and plus 6 British officers and 7 Malay officers who were injured and died during the battle. So you know the story of Lieutenant Adnan Saidi. So the constant rumor I've always heard is that, he was tied up on a tree, bayoneted to death, honey pot of him set on fire. He was actually bayoneted first and then hung on the tree. But there were also cases of other soldiers who were treated worse than him. But nevertheless, it's the fact that they fought very bravely, they were constantly outnumbered, and they never once tried to run away. They actually engaged almost to the point of face-to-face combat. So that's the Malay regiment for you. This is the surrender chamber. the surrender chamber when the Japanese surrendered to Singapore took place right in this room here. So that's where they signed the instrument of surrender, and thereafter, Louis Mountbatten walked out to the City Hall steps where you were just now and greeted the people of Singapore who was waiting to hear of the formalization of the surrender. So the next significant moment was actually the swearing in of the first cabinet of Singapore in 1959. I will tell you some of the background story after this multimedia production that you're going to see. So it was again here, facing this direction. That scene was never photographed because photographers were prohibited to enter this place. So second floor, the gallery was just packed with journalists and other authorized witnesses, and the swearing in of the first cabinet took place. Okay, and then again, they went out and there's this whole crowd of Singaporeans or people of Singapore who are out there waiting to cheer the first cabinet. Okay, so why are we at this level on this landing? Because there was a very important person and there's a very important room here. Did you know the Prime Minister of Singapore then, Mr. Lee Kuan Yew, had an office here? And this is where we think it used to be. The question is asked, why do we not know exactly where it was? Because we don't. There's no plans revealing the exact location for security reasons. Even when all the ministries and all the top civil servants were here, we interviewed them. I think most of them couldn't tell where the Prime Minister's office was. So what happened after the war? We gained city status in 1951, and that is when municipal building was renamed as City Hall. We remained a city up till 1958 because in 1959 we achieved internal self-government. So that was the Merdeka talks. David Marshall was our chief minister and he was fighting for internal self-government, but it didn't take off because the British government would not allow Singapore to handle the foreign affairs and internal security. He said, you can run the city, it's your city, do whatever you want for the people and all that, but we continue to control this country in terms of foreign policies, foreign relations, and internal security. And David Marshall said no, and he resigned as chief minister. And then the next year, with the new chief minister, Lim Yew Hock, they went back to negotiate, went back to London to negotiate for internal self-government, and eventually they were able to agree, but still with these 2 points not given to Singapore. Internal Self-Government Act was signed in 1958. Singapore became a self-government in 1959 and held our first elections, and that's when the People's Action Party won landslide victory, and that's why we have the swearing in of the first cabinet in that room that you just came up from. So this is all government stuff. Meanwhile, for the people, what else happened? Mr. Lee Kuan Yew felt that the Singaporeans or people of Singapore did not know enough of each other. The Malays have their own life, the Chinese have their own life, much as in our daily lives, we were just interacting with each other, but there was not enough programs to help people understand each other's culture fully. So he started this program called the Aneka Ragam Rakyat. I think some of you may recall, do you recall this event? So our City Hall steps designed as a natural stage, and our field was designed like a natural audience sitting area. They made full use of it. Our City Hall steps was used for all these cultural performances from 1959 to 64. Okay, for all occasions, not just Chinese New Year, you have National Loyalty Week, you have celebrating the National Day during the times where we were part of Malaysia. If you think that we only started to celebrate our National Day parade in 1966, then have a second thought, because when we were part of Malaysia, we celebrated National Day too, as Malaysia, sing the Malaysian national anthem. So that was in 1960 to 1963. You look at the photos of There's nothing changed. It looked very much the same. They always get more and more elaborate over the years, and it changed over the years, until eventually our National Day was moved away from the Padang because it is simply too small.